what we're going to talk about is the Enlightenment. And I know you've talked about this in World, and you've talked about it in American One, and you're so sick and tired of hearing about it, but it is a significant event that really does change the world. And not just when we look at the European countries where the Enlightenment more or less kind of took place, but its lasting effects on the Americas, Africa, Asia, all these countries will be affected by these philosophers in Europe complaining, talking, discussing about their government and religion and what that means. So the Enlightenment still impacts us today. The fact that you question the government, the fact that you question institutions altogether is really, it really comes down to this part. So before the Enlightenment, you got Fluffy the cat there destroying the world. That's kind of how the government and the institutions were in Europe. So Europe was very much run by monarchs, kings, queens, and it was run by the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church. And if you were a Protestant like they were in England, your king is the head of your church. And if you were Catholic like the French were, the Pope helped the king rule, and the king had to obey the Pope because that's part of the faith. So they kind of always ensured that they always stayed in power. And so the government really didn't think that ordinary people were really important. And so you see Fluffy kind of just taking out the people. So the next thing we're going to look at is this guy named Voltaire. And you probably studied him very briefly in your world class, maybe not as much in American One. But Voltaire, he's French, and he's a writer. He comes up with some issues that he has with the French government. A lot's going on with religion and the Catholic and the Protestant faiths in France, particularly in the city of Paris. And so he kind of starts to question the king's power and this power of saying to certain faiths, certain religions, you can't stay here, you can't live here. And so what he started to believe that life is better when we have liberty, when we have freedom. And one of those crucial aspects to having that liberty would be having freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Now, as people who live in America and could be American citizens, maybe you're not, this is something that you always see on the television, you see it in the social media. People are always talking about how they have freedom of speech. Well, Voltaire felt that if people had the ability to voice their issues, their complaints, their likes, then you would actually have true freedom. But in order for you to have that and do that, you also have to take away the church's power in the government. So he believed in a freedom of speech and religion, a separation of your church and state. And state doesn't mean like state of North Carolina. State is talking about like a government. So your head of your government, and in our case it would be the president, cannot be the same as the head of your religious faith. So whatever church or mosque or any of the temples that you might go to worship, it needs to be separate. And so when you look at what, like I've got for the visual here, I have V for Voltaire. And imagine it like your hands cupped together, like you're praying. And what Voltaire wants to do is he wants to wedge freedom in your hands. And he believes that speech and that religion is going to wedge it far enough apart that you're actually going to have freedom. So you got to separate that government and that religion, the church. You got to pull them apart. You got to pry them apart. And he always is famous for this comment. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And what he's talking about here is people having the right to have their own opinion of stuff. And that you don't have to agree with someone else's opinion, but you should support their right to have an opinion. Okay? And when we do that, we will have true freedom, true liberty. And I think it's an important point to make about what Voltaire is and what his philosophy is that we can be together, we can have differences of opinion, but we can coexist. So just think of like the little hands praying. Think about how he wants to put freedom of religion and freedom of speech between those praying hands, and he wants to pry them apart. And he's sarcastic. So if you look up quotes about the guy, he's going to be talking about destroy the infamous thing. And what he's talking about is religion, but he's not talking about destroy the institution of the church. He's just saying you can't let a religious leader rule all aspects of your life, because what if you don't follow that faith? How fair is that to you? You grew up Catholic and you got a Protestant telling you this is the way it's going to be, or vice versa. Or you grew up Islamic and now you've got a Christian telling you how things are going to be. So he says you got to just separate it all together from your government. So in Voltaire's influence over us as the United States, big thing, First Amendment. And you guys are going to learn the First Amendment. You're going to learn this thing called RAPS. So religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. So that's just the easiest way to remember the rights that are guaranteed to you in the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is a part of the Bill of Rights. All right. So he doesn't influence really the assembly, the petition, the press kind of thing. What his real direct influence is definitely on religion and speech. Inadvertently, not directly, but like an indirect way, he does definitely have some influence there on press and petition and assembly. Because if you really do have the right to have freedom of speech, you're going to see people gathering peacefully to talk about that, to debate that. You're going to see people, as a result, asking the government for change. If you really have freedom of speech, your media, your news outlets can post and discuss things that the government might not agree with, or the government might not want somebody to share. The criticism of the government, it would be out there because you would have true freedom. So even though he's got a direct influence on the religion part and the speech part, he kind of indirectly affects the others as well through his thinking. So when our founding fathers are writing the Bill of Rights, which is an addition to the Constitution, they put this as like the first thing. This is number one on their list. And remember, the Bill of Rights, it's protecting you from the government taking these things away from you. Like, the government cannot take away your freedom of religion. And so there's two clauses in this. The Establishment Clause. The U.S. government is not allowed to create a religion for this country. We are not a one-size-fits-all kind of country. We're a very, very, very diverse nation, religious-wise and every other way. So the United States government is not a Christian government. It's not a Protestant government. It's not a Catholic government. It's nothing. It has no faith. And no government in this country is allowed to establish one. It's in the Constitution. So if the state of North Carolina tomorrow said, everybody in this state is going to become, let's just use the example of Baptists. They can't do it. Baptists have very little differences in their faith. They're Protestant, but they have little differences in their faith versus other Protestant faiths. So people get upset. And what if you're not Christian? You're really going to get upset because Baptists are Christians. What if you're Islamic? What if you are atheist? You don't believe in anything. So that is why our government does not allow any state to create a religion or to enforce prayer at school or anything like that. Because if it is a government institution like public schools, they're not allowed to establish a faith. This is the Establishment Clause. The next thing, the government has this clause called the Free Exercise Clause. People are allowed to worship freely their religion in the United States. Now, there's, of course, some limits on that. Like, your religion cannot infringe on somebody else's. Okay? So, if you believe in human sacrifice, and I give crazy examples because it sticks in your head, you can't do that because that's taking away another person's life. Okay? So, the government has to protect your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And we're going to look at that with one of our philosophers. So the government's never allowed to let somebody take that away without like just cause. So that's why, like the death penalty is only for people who actually have committed murder. So when you look at Voltaire and you look at his influence, it's really at the root of our country and what our country is talking about with our Bill of Rights and our First Amendment.